Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this class. A little complicated area of halakha, where we're going to talk about dairy breads, and then a little later about meat bread. And we're going to get into some interesting conversations about what we call things. Like, for example, what we call the bread that we eat on Shabbat as challah. It's not really why it's called challah, as you all know, because it comes from the mitzvah to take part of the dough and in the time of the Torah, time of Mikdash, to give it to the Kohen. And now, Zecher Mikdash, we still take away part of the bread, hence why it's called challah. The reason why we shape the bread the way that we do is very relevant to this class, as you will see, because shaping the bread is often as a siman, as a sign to let us know that that bread is not parv, but that bread may in fact be meat or perhaps dairy. So there was a rabbinic enactment that out of concern of basar b'chalav, of eating meat and milk together by mistake, our rabbis prohibited making large quantities of dairy bread because someone might not realize that there's butter in it, and therefore one would end up having that dairy bread with meat unbeknownst to them. And we're going to see that here in this Gemara. It's found in Masechet Pesachim, Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. It says here, Ked'amar lohu Rabbi Yoshua labanea. Rabbi Yoshua would say to his children, Yom Kama lo tashuli b'chalva. On the first night of Pesach, don't knead for me dough with milk. Mikan ve'elach, but on the other nights or the other days, lo shuli b'chalva. Then you can mix the milk into the dough. So I guess it's some kind of fried matzah, who knows what he was having, some dairy and some milk and some sort of matzah there. V'hatanya, but the Gemara brings a challenge from the form of a braita. En lashin et ha'isa b'chalav. We have a teaching, you're not allowed to knead dough with milk, period, not Pesach related, just normally, you're not allowed to do it. V'im lash, and if one did knead such bread with dairy, kol hapata surah. All of the bread is forbidden. Why? Mipnei hergel avera, because one will become accustomed to prohibiting, not intentionally, but unintentionally. You won't realize it's dairy one time, and you'll end up eating it with meat. Kedama Ravina, as Ravina said, Ke'en Torah shareh, Hachaname ke'en Torah. And so the answer is as follows. Ravina, it's like the teaching that Ravina said, if it's in the shape of a bull's eye, an ox's eye, then it's mutar, it's permitted. Here too, the Braita is talking about a case where he told them, Rabbi Yoshua told his sons, prepare the mitzvah like an ox's eye. Now, what does it mean to be like an ox's eye? Is that talking about the size of an ox's eye? Or is it talking about the shape of an ox's eye, a shape being round? Or is it talking about an ox's eye being small? Rashi explains, me'at, a little bit, ka'ayin shel shur, like an ox's eye. Then you're allowed, if it's only a small amount of dough, then you can knead it with milk. Because you'll eat all the bread in one sitting. And therefore, he will not delay it such that he will forget that it was kneaded with milk. So Rashi says, when is the time? If I'm going to make dairy bread normally, it's asur. Why? Because I'm going to have leftover bread, and with the leftover bread, I'm going to forget that it is chalavi, I'm going to forget that it's leche, and I'm going to eat it with meat, chas v'shalom. But if it's a small amount of bread, like the size of an eye of an ox, then I have no problem. Harambam, on the other hand, Maimonides in source 42 says, En lashina isa bechalav, don't knead it, the dough with milk. V'im lash, and if one did do so, kol hapat asura, the whole bread is forbidden, b'pnei hergel avera, because you will be accustomed to unwittingly mixing meat and milk. Shema yochal babasar, because perhaps you will eat it with meat. V'im shina b'tzurat hapat, but if he changed the form of the bread, ad shetehei nikeret, that it was recognizable, mutar, then it is permissible. Says the Rambam, you're missing the point. It's not the size of how much bread you make, it's the shape of the bread. So therefore, if I have a round loaf, the round loaf tells me it is a dairy loaf. And perhaps, my friends, or not perhaps, I'm telling you this for a fact, the shape that we have for our chalot on Shabbat, where they are braided, is because that tells you that they are normally baked with meat in the same oven, and therefore those are meat loaves, or loaves which can only be eaten with meat. The Shulchan Aruch takes both the position of Rashi and Rambam to explain the halacha. En lashin isa bechalav, normally speaking, you're not allowed to make dairy bread. Sorry, just before we go into that, Jonathan is asking about the question. So are round chalot, which are not normally meant to be eaten with a dairy meal, why are they round on Rosh Hashanah? It's a great question. I was thinking the same thing as I was walking over here. It's not just the Shavuot round bread, so it would be a problem for Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, where people have round loaves. Why are they round? Maybe they're telling you that they're thinking more there on the circle of life. Perhaps the circle is for a different reason, but it creates another question here, John, which is if everyone has the convention that the round bread represents dairy, doing the round bread to show you the circle of life or the circle of the new year, it's a problem, because then I'm thinking I'm having a dairy bread, and in fact it's a meat bread or it's a parv bread. It's a confusion. So it's an interesting piece. But we're going to see as we have a look through the sources how this develops a little bit further. And I'll come back to it, John. So if I don't answer Jonathan fully, just let me know. Ein lashin isa bechalav, says Maran, don't knead dough with dairy. Shema yavol ochlaim habasa, lest you come to eat it with meat unwittingly. V'im lash, and if one did knead it, kol patasur, then normally speaking, the whole bread is forbidden. Afilu la'ochla levada, even if you were to eat it, this large amount of bread by itself. So that's the normal position there. But Maran explains, vim haya davar mu'at, but if it's something small, kedei achila bevat achat, where it can be eaten in one time, i.e. one meal, then it's permitted to have a dairy loaf. Or sheshinat tzurat hapat, or he changed the form of the bread, shetei nikeret shelo yochal ba basar, and the form was such a strange shape that it was clear to everyone that it was dairy and one would not come to eat it with meat, then it is mutar, it's permissible. So Maran is giving us two outs. Either you make a small amount like Rashi, or you make it a strange shape like Harambam. Kayotze bo, similarly, ein ofin pat betanor shetachu ba'aliyah, v'im afa'o dino ke'isa shenilusha b'chelev. Shenilusha b'chalav, sorry, b'chelev, nachon. Similarly, one may not bake bread in an oven that had non-kosher animal fat spread over it. And then the din is the same thing as if it had been kneaded with dairy. So he's saying here, if I was to do this with there were in those times they would actually share their ovens non-Jews, so they'd be very concerned about animal fat, forbidden animal fat, which, not to confuse you, is often called chelev, as opposed to chalav, which means milk. But let's not get too nitty-gritty in that. But trying to figure out if it's chalav or chelev can be a bit of a tongue twister when you're reading it, especially when there's no nikud. But here we're understanding that just as you're not allowed to have dairy bread unless it's small or has this strange shape, similarly, you're not allowed to bake bread in the same oven that had non-kosher animal fat spread over it. Just adding that in parentheses. The Rama adds, Lachen, nohagin lalush pat im chalav b'chag HaShavuot. It is our custom to knead bread with dairy for Shavuot, as some of you did. As my daughter made us some beautiful dairy bread on Shavuot. Gam b'shuman lichvod Shabbat, or with permissible kosher animal fat, i.e. making it meaty, lichvod Shabbat, for Friday night or for Shabbat. He calls them mechshev davar kedavar mu'at, because all this is considered like a small amount. Gam kitzuratan meshuna meshar hapat, as well as the fact that their shape is different from other bread. Okay, now, if I had to be careful there looking at this, is Maran and the Rama, are they saying the same thing, or is there a slight nuance between them? The Peri Megadim wants to suggest that there is a different thing going on here between the Rama and Maran. According to the Peri Megadim, Umahu davar mu'ad, what is considered something small, a small amount, B'Shulchan Aruch in Maran mashma kedei achila b'var achat, how much one can eat in one time, i.e. one meal. Omnam, rather, in the Torat Chatat of the Rama, in Klal Samach Daf Bet, Kol liyoma have a davar mu'at, whatever is for the whole day is considered a davar mu'at. And how much is a whole day? 3 meals. So according to the Pri Megadim, he could learn out by Shulchan Aruch it's enough bread for 1 meal, but according to the Rama, it's enough bread for 3 meals. And the Sefer HaKashrut explains that, and he codifies that the sages forbade baking bread with milk or butter out of concern that people may come to eat it with meat. And likewise, one may not bake bread with meat fat, even if it was chicken, due to concern that one will eat it with cheese or milk, except in one of these ways. And one of the exceptions, number 1, when the bread has a different form, that was the position of the Rambam, it is recognizable from the top of the bread that it is dairy or meat. Again, similar form of the Rambam there. And number 3 there, when all of the bread will be eaten, Sfaradim in 1 meal, that's Maran, Ashkenazim according to the Pri Megadim and Rama, over the course of all the meals of that day. Okay? So the Pitkei Teshuvah, as well as the Yalkut Yosef, notes that once the bread is already baked, if it is too big to be eaten at one time, or in one day for the Ashkenazim, one no longer has permission to divide it up into smaller pieces to give out to individuals. Likewise, one may no longer change the form of the bread once it is baked. This is because the moment that it was baked, it is already forbidden. And this comes into the question, if all this is true, Rabbi, why are there so many dairy breads on the market which have hashgacha in the supermarkets? They all have kosher certification. So look at this Pitkei Teshuvah. Have a look in the Chaveh Da'at shekatav od dishinui ein mo'il rak keshiyeshna b'sha'at afiyah. The change in the form does not help except if it was changed at the time of baking, when there was no prohibition upon it at all. But making a change after it was already forbidden is not effective. Similarly, and this is the point which is relevant to us, it's forbidden to divide it up for many people so that each one receives a small amount, since it was already forbidden and has become equivalent to nevela, to something which is non-kosher. And that is the opinion of the Pri Megadim against the Kaftor Vaferach. Now, if you have a look here in this footnote number 9, Again, if you want to look at source number 8, he's explaining here why pizza dough is fine and cheesecake is fine, because all those things, that's so clear even without looking that it's a dairy item, and that's why it's permitted 100%. But here, when we're talking about the kosher certification here, why is it permitted? There's a couple of reasons why we allow it. He goes in here and says it's beyond the scope. But the difference is, if I'm a home baker, I shouldn't be making lots and lots of batches of dairy bread. I should only make dairy bread for a one-time consumption, especially for Sfaradim. For Ashkenazim, at least enough for the holiday, but no longer than that. So how is it that supermarkets are allowed, or industrial bakers can make so much dairy loaves? And that's because we're going to make a distinction between them and home bakers, and that's why it's omitted. But again, if you have a look, if you were to Google this into a search, and you'll find the OU and the Circle K and the CRC and all these other agencies, they all go into a long definition of why it's permissible. But trust me, there's a lot of ink spilled on this, so we know it's not such a straightforward answer. Carrying on, the Pitrei Teshuvah states that the prohibition of eating dairy bread applies even if milk accidentally spilled onto the bread, or one mistakenly baked it. The reason is that the prohibition is not a penalty for an intentional violation, but rather due to a concern that perhaps one will do so by mistake, that they will come to eat meat and dairy together. And that's why the rabbis are so careful with this. It's not someone would intentionally violate meat and milk, it's that they would do so without realizing it. And therefore he says, from the fact that the poskim do not specify, it seems that even unintentionally it is forbidden. Okay, normally we say, lechatchila, it's asur, but b'diavad, after the fact, it should be permitted. But here it's saying, even b'diavad, even after the fact, one cannot have dairy bread, especially if it's large, except perhaps for these factories. But again, I don't want to go into it because it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're offering here. Now, does the prohibition of dairy bread apply as well to other foods not made with dough that are generally eaten with both dairy and meat, e.g. spices, ketchup, and the like? According to the Taz, in fact, one may not add dairy to them due to the same concern that people will assume it is parv. But many other achronim, such as the Aruch HaShulchan, the Minchat Yaakov, and the Chochmat Adam, hold that the halacha of dairy bread applies only to bread. Why? Because bread is what we live on. And again, for me, I'm on a low-carb lifestyle. I only have bread on Shabbat now and Yom Tov, but I can certainly agree for most of my life that al halechem yichya adam, a person lives about bread, is a big piece. And therefore, with bread, the rabbis were strict about, but other things such as spices and other things like that, the rabbis did not decree against it. And therefore, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, the rule that dairy bread is totally forbidden, and not just forbidden to be eaten with meat, is unique to bread. Since bread is the mainstay of the diet, therefore it is more likely that people may eat it with the wrong type of food, and therefore that's why it is the rabbis made that ruling. But for others, lo gazrinan, they did not extend their decree onto that. Okay, now there is another area where we are lenient. For those of us who like dairy pastries, okay? There, since one normally would not eat a sweet pastry with meat, and it's like a dessert item, there one can have that. It can be a dairy. It can have dairy with the dough because they're gonna be, again, there'll be no concern that the person would eat it by mistake. So the Yalkut Yosef, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef explains here, even though Chazal or rabbis forbade kneading dough with milk, lest one come to eat the bread with meat, nevertheless, it is permitted to knead dough for a sweet cake with sugar and milk or butter. Why? She'en derech le'achol ima tavshil shel basar b'pnei metikuta. It's not the normal way to eat something sweet to eat that with meat. Okay, because the sweetness would make it, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be appetizing. Indeed, the Gemara tells us there's one combination you're not meant to have. Meat and honey is meant to be a very bad combination. Okay, and again, I'm sure there's culinary people will tell me that there are meat and honey dishes, but here it's saying that generally the Talmud says that you don't have meat with sweets. And therefore you're allowed to make chocolate with milk or with butter. And therefore all you need to do is put on the packaging that it is dairy or whether it is parv. Okay, so therefore there are some areas there to be lenient. So just to wrap up what we've seen, that dairy breads need to either be small that can be eaten in one meal or one day, depending if it's Sephardic or Ashkenazic, or it needs to be in a strange form, which is clearly dairy. The things which don't have a problem being dairy are things which are like cheesecakes or pizzas, which is very clear what they are, or if it's something which isn't a bread. For example, spices, they're fine. You can have dairy in them. And if it is a cake or it's a pastry or something like that, and no one would have that with meat, then that also would be fine. As to the question of how do kosher agencies permit large commercial bakings of dairy breads, it's a long issue which I'm not going to go into, but again, feel free to look into it, but it seems to be they're making a distinction between what's done commercially versus what's done in local home baking. All right, now go into leftover bread and separate tablecloths. Okay, so let's say I've got some leftover bread and I ate that bread with meat. Can I now have it with dairy or vice versa? Says the Gemara and the Yerushalmi here in Pesachim, Amar Rav Yosef, Hahein de'ochel chovetz u'v'da'atei michol kupad tzarich meba'eh pisat. One who ate cheese and intends to eat meat must dispose of the piece of bread. Okay? And this is important here. For example, on Shavuot, as we just said, the Ashkenazic minhag, and also Sephardic minhag, but not necessarily here in Seattle, is to have this one loaf of bread with the dairy appetizer, and then after the dairy first course, to then have a new loaf of bread to have with the meat, but certainly not to use the same loaf for both pieces of it. So this is where that basis is from. It's from this Gemara here in Yerushalmi, that you're not allowed to use the same bread to eat dairy and to eat meat with, even if that bread is palva. The Bet Yosef says, again, the Bet Yosef is Maran Shulchan Aruch, his commentary on the Torah. He wrote here, V'katuv b'hagot Ashireh, in the name of the Or Zarua, Mitzvah min hamuvcha, the best way to do the mitzvah, Heicha she'achal gevina, if one ate cheese, v'rotzeh lechol basar, and then he wants to eat meat, tzarich la'avim ala shulchan halechem, he needs to remove the bread from the table, v'chol ha'ma'achal she'alu im hagvina, and all the food that was served with the cheese, ala shulchan, from the table. And then he brings the meat and he eats. And there you can see it, that's how it's done. Again, it's not that big a practice today because it sounds like a bit of an effort to have a whole dairy course with a dairy tablecloth and dairy starters and dairy accoutrements, and then clear them all up, and then bring in a meat tablecloth and meat arrangements. However, I have seen it in many rabbinic homes. Not my own, but I have seen it around. Okay, generally I kind of, we do a dairy meal, and then we'll have a meat meal at another time, or vice versa. You know, very, very, very similar to how we Sephardics do here in Seattle, of the meat meal on Friday night and the dairy meal on Shabbat morning. Sometimes you could do it the opposite. Shavuot night, we'll have a dairy night meal and a meat meal for lunch. Again, or vice versa. The Shulchan Aruch codifies, Misha achal gvina v'rotzeh le'achol basar, someone who ate cheese and wants to eat meat, tzarich leva'em al shulchan shirei pat she'achlo im hagvina. He needs to remove from the table the crumbs of the bread that were eaten with the cheese. Okay? And when it says shirei pat, it's leftovers or crumbs or whatever, any type of bread, you cannot eat that with the bread. Okay, and then it says here, for further investigation concerning bread that is cooked with meat and eaten with dairy, see page 99. We're going to see that at the end of tonight's lecture. Okay, so here we are. The Sefer Kashrut adds that if the bread was cut with a parv knife and certainly did not touch other foods, then in that situation, one may eat it during a meal of the other type. Again, if someone is very careful. Bread that was left over from a meat meal is forbidden to eat at a dairy meal, and the same applies to leftovers of bread from a dairy meal for eating at a meat meal. Ela im ken, unless nifras halechem b'sakin parve, unless he used a parve knife to cut the knife. I mean, a parve knife, sorry, to cut the bread. Vaya halechem munach b'makom shebevadai lo ba b'maga machalim. And it has to be a case where nothing came into contact with the bread did not come into contact with the food. And he inspected it to ensure that food residue did not remain on it. So again, if you can be very careful to make sure, then there can be a situation, says the Sefer Kashrut, where you can use the same bread. If it's a palva loaf, you can use it for meat and milk. If you have a very careful set-aside section with a parv knife and a parv board, and you're slicing it up, and maybe perhaps you're even moving it away when you're bringing out the cheese. Rav Moshe Feinstein limits this halacha specifically to a small piece of bread, but not to a loaf or a much larger piece of it that was on the table, as in that case, one is careful to make sure it did not touch any of the dairy food on the table. Okay, so again, you can read that. It's specifically a small amount, where he says here, the prohibition applies only to remnants of a piece of bread that cheese was eaten with, or the small piece that he cut in order to eat cheese with it, as one is not careful about this since he intended to eat it with the cheese. Therefore, even if he says that cheese did not touch it, it is like a matter that he did not think about and he did not keep it in mind, as it states in Siman 18 and the Shach. But a large loaf of bread that is ready to be used, both for dairy and for meat, people they're careful about it and one need not be concerned, okay? So the concern is the small amount. If it's a small amount, for sure it's going to become dairy or it's going to become meat. But if it's a large loaf, then someone's going to be careful that it doesn't get contaminated almost. Now, does this halacha of not eating leftover bread from a meat meal at a dairy meal apply to other parva foods as well? For example, may one serve leftovers from a salad or parva noodles served at a meat meal on Shabbat, at a dairy meal on Sunday? As we saw, although the Agot HaShireh does mention other foods, the Shulchan Aruch does not. And the Badei HaShulchan addresses the question by saying it depends on the chances of whether the meat foods came into contact with the bread. And therefore, if there is no concern, or there is a low concern, then one does not need to do it. However, mitzvah min hamuvchar, the best possible way of doing it is to be careful so that one doesn't have such a scenario. Now, do we need to use separate tablecloths? Okay, this comes from the Rashba. The Rashba is Rav Shimon ben Aderet, who was a Talmud of the Ramban. He lived in Spain, one of the greatest of the Sephardic Rishonim. It's a great commentary on the Talmud, and he had a number of She'elot Teshuvah, a number of responsive material. And he writes here, the matter seems clear to me that it is forbidden to eat cheese on a tablecloth on which meat was eaten, and similarly to eat meat on a tablecloth on which cheese was eaten, since there is no tablecloth that was eaten upon that does not have a few drops of meat. I do not say this due to what was absorbed in it, since absorbed substances are not expelled through something hot. But I say, and this is the truth, that there is meat residue on the tablecloth, drops of the food often fall on it, and this is frequent, and similarly, people wipe the knife used to cut meat on it. Therefore, we are accustomed to be very careful about this, and one who guards his soul will distance himself from them. Now, all that being said, this is dealing with people who eat directly on the tablecloth. Okay? Shulchan Aruch says, it is forbidden to eat cheese on the table on which meat was eaten. The Rama says, and so it's the opposite is forbidden. The Radbaz notes, though, that the Rashba was referring to situations where the meat and dairy foods were placed directly on the tablecloth. In that case, there is concern that perhaps the two types of food will come directly into contact with one another. But if plates are used and the foods never touch the tablecloth directly, it is permitted to reuse the tablecloth for the other type of food. And this is the conclusion of the Yalkut Yosef as well. And you can see that there in the Pitkei Tshuva. See what the Radbaz writes, that the words of the Rav apply only when they place the meat and cheese on the tablecloth directly. And then there is no concern that perhaps they will stick to it. And there is concern that perhaps they will stick together. But our custom is to bring every food onto the table in a bowl. Therefore, it is sufficient to reverse the tablecloth alone and remove the pieces even to comply with the stringency of the Rashba. And the Radbaz concludes that this is the custom. And that's the Sephardic approach. Sephardic approach, if you don't eat directly on the table, you have nothing to worry about. The Ashkenazic position, as brought down by Rav Binyamin Forst in the Laws of Kashrut on page 211, he writes that the custom is, at the very least, is to reverse them, but the common custom is not to eat meat and dairy on the same table or plastic tablecloth surface, okay? And that's the Ashkenazic position, even if you're not eating directly, but you can see that there in full in source 59. So here we have all the summary. And again, I always encourage you to read these summaries because it really goes into everything here very clearly, where you can see exactly what's going on. Every position is summarized into a one-liner or a few words. Okay, you can see that all there. And here's what we've done tonight with this dairy bread section. The Gemara, you're not allowed to eat dairy bread. Then we had the Rashi. This means it's small in size, it's a small eye, whereas the Rambam is the shape. Shulchan Aruch rules like Rashi and Rambam, giving you two leniencies. Shulchan Aruch is one meal, whereas the Ramah is one day. And then you have all those other places, even if it's unintentional, it's forbidden. Does it apply to other foods? Taz says yes, the Aruch HaShulchan says no. And then the Yalkut Yosef says that any food that is not usually eaten with meat is fine. You don't have to worry about dairy, such as pastries and chocolates and everything else like that. If it's clearly dairy like cheesecake or pizza, then again, no other issues. Then the leftovers we talked about there, Igrat Moshe, the Batei HaShulchan, using the same tablecloths. The prohibition applies only when one doesn't use plates, but otherwise it is permitted. It's the position of the Radbaz, who was a great Sephardic rabbi in Mitzrayim. And then you have the laws of Kashrut by Rabbi First. Although it is permitted to use the same tablecloth for meat and dairy under certain conditions, which is when it's washed in between, the common custom is to have separate tablecloths. That's Ashkenazic position. It's not something that Sfaradim follow. Now, to finish off tonight, we can have a look at this question about, we talked about dairy breads. What about if the bread was made in the same oven as a meat dish is being cooked? You've got two dishes in the oven. You've got your bread, which has par of ingredients, but it's baked in the same oven as where there's something which is meat in there. Can I have that bread with dairy? So here he goes. This is brought down by Rav Doron Podlashuk. A common question that arises when dealing with the laws of basar b'chalav, of meat and milk, is whether bread or other parva foods that were cooked or reheated in the oven at the same time as meat may be eaten together with dairy. This question is complex and it deals with two separate sugyot, two different passages in the Talmud. One is reicha, the smell or the aroma, and one is zeah, the steam or the sweat. This article will focus on the topic of reicha, the smell or the aroma. The Gemara Masechet Pesachim quotes the following: Tanei Rav Kahana braid Rav Chinena Saba, pat she'af'a im tzli b'tanur, asur la'ochla b'kutach. Rav Kahana, son of Rav Chinena, the elder teaches, in the case of bread that one baked together with roasting meat in the oven, it is prohibited to eat the bread with kutach. And kutach is, they're being very nice to call it a type of dairy yogurt. And you know what kutach really is? It's milk which has gone bad, which is eaten with stale or moldy bread. It's really not very nice, but apparently it was some kind of, I'm not sure whether it was a delicacy in the time of the Talmud or just something which was very defined as a dairy item. So why did Rav Kahana prohibit this? Is this another restriction and separation the rabbis enacted between meat and milk, similar to those mentioned in the Shi'ur? Or is this something more fundamental? As you will see, this is essentially a dispute among the Rishonim, the rabbis of between 1,000 and 1,500. The classic understanding of most Rishonim is that the stringency is not unique to the laws of milk and meat, but is applicable to all types of prohibited mixtures. This is based on the principle of reicha, of smell, meaning that the meaty smell present in the oven has been absorbed on some level by the bread and is therefore prohibited to eat the bread with dairy. However, some Rishonim understand that this prohibition is unique to basar b'chalav, to meat and milk, and does not necessarily have anything to do with this question of whether reicha milta or lav milta is the aroma. Is it substantive or is it not substantive? Is it significant or not? In order to understand this argument, we need to examine the topic of aroma. This topic is located in the same location in Pesachim as the passage previously quoted, and the Gemara states that it is a subject of a dispute between Rav and Levi. Rav said, fatty kosher meat that one roasted in an oven together with lean and non-kosher meat is forbidden, even if the two meats never came into contact with one another. My timer, what is the reason? It is that they are flavored from one another. The fatty meat emits an aroma that is absorbed in the non-kosher meat, and the aroma is then transferred back to the kosher meat, causing the kosher meat to absorb some aroma from the non-kosher meat. And Levi said, the aroma does not cause meat to be forbidden. Even lean kosher meat that one roasted with fatty non-kosher meat is permitted. My timer, what is the reason? Although the non-kosher meat emits an aroma that is absorbed into the kosher meat, it is merely an aroma, and an aroma is nothing. Lav miltahi is nothing significant. So I think the aroma, the smell, or even the ze'ah, the steam, isn't of any significance. According to Rav, it is significant. According to Levi, it is not significant. According to the Gemara here, Rav holds that aroma is, whereas Levi states that reacha lav milta, aroma is not. Rashi rules in accordance with Levi that reach is not significant. He explains that even though the Gemara concludes the argument between Rav and Levi with the statements of Rav Kahana brought above, that if one cooked bread together with meat, it is prohibited to eat the bread with dairy, implying the aroma is significant in accordance with Rav. This opinion of Rav Kahana is not accepted. This is because we find a similar argument between Abaye and Rava in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, where reicha, where aroma is of significance. The Gemara there discusses whether it is permitted for a Jew to smell the wine of a non-Jew, where you're not allowed to get benefit from Isur Hana'ah, from something which is prohibited, in order to ascertain how long the wine will last. Abaye forbids this as it considered deriving benefits, while Rava states that it is considered a recha, it's just a smell, and smell lav milti is not significant. Rashi explains that since the halacha is in accordance with the Rava, when he argues with Abaye in all of Shas, it must be that the halacha here follows Levi, who agrees with Rava. Okay? So therefore, based on this position, Rashi explains that we hold like Levi and Rava, and how do Levi and Rava both hold, that Reicha Lav Miltahi, that aroma, that smell is not significant. In contrast to Rashi, Tosafot quote Rabbeinu Tam, who holds that the halacha is like Rav and aroma is significant. And if it's not more complicated enough, we all know that Rabbeinu Tam is one of Rashi's grandchildren. And hence the kosher meat would indeed be prohibited if cooked together with a nevela. Tosfot assert the fact that Rava ruled that Reicha Lav Milta regarding the wine is not relevant to our topic, as the two cases are very different. Tosfot opine that the reason Rava states that aroma is insignificant is because the smell of the wine is very potent and damaging to one's health. With regard to other cases of aroma, though, Rabbeinu Tam argues that it is significant based on the fact that the Gemara in Pesachim concluded with the ruling of Rav Kahana. So Tosfot and Rashi both understand the reason of Rav Kahana prohibits the bread that was baked with meat to be eaten with dairy is because the bread absorbed the aroma of the meat. They only argue whether his opinion is accepted in halacha or not. Now, so far I got two Ashkenazic Rishonim, Rashi and Tosfot, both related to each other. But as I've told you many times before, they're great commentaries on the Gemara. They're not necessarily the biggest heavyweights in halacha. The Rif, on the other hand, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, is one of the big three main pillars that the Shulchan Aruch relies on. And the Rif agrees with Rashi that the halacha is in accordance with Levi, that the aroma is lav miltahi, is not significant, and brings many proofs to substantiate this claim and rebut those who rule like Rav. Regarding the proof raised by Tosfot that Rav Kahana prohibited bread that was baked in an oven with meat to be eaten with dairy, the Rif explains that the case of the bread is different, and even Levi would agree to this stringency. He gives two reasons why the case of bread is different. Although Levi holds that aroma is insignificant, this is only in a situation of bedi avad, of after the fact, where such cooking already occurred. But even Levi would agree that if it would be prohibited initially to roast kosher meat together with a nevela simultaneously in the same oven. In the case of the bread, since after it is baked with meat, it may still be eaten without dairy, permitting one to eat it with dairy would be akin to saying that one can cook kosher meat lechatchila with non-kosher meat, which would be a major issue. This is a case of davar sheyesh lo matirin, of something that could be permitted, and we mentioned before that when you have something which is a davar sheyesh lo matirin, something which can be permitted, the rabbis were extra strict and said you can't even have 1 in 1,000. The Ran challenges both of the Rif's explanations concerning the case of Rav Kahana. Firstly, the Ran argues that Levi held his opinion even lechatchila, and therefore the Rif's distinction is not valid. He also argues that this cannot be the case of davar sheyesh lo matirin, because, and he goes into another case here of min b'she'eno mina. Again, this is a very complicated area of halacha here, where he's quoting a number of different shitot to add it up. Okay, the Ran gives 3 possible answers. Number 1, Rav Kahana disagrees with Levi, but nevertheless we do not concern ourselves with his opinion, since we follow Rava. Number 2, although Rav Kahana in truth rules like Levi, that reicha lav milta, the aroma is not significant. In this case, since the flavor of the meat can be discerned in the bread, people eating this bread with dairy might come to the erroneous conclusion that actual meat was absorbed in the bread, and mistakenly permit other cases when there is a real mixture of meat and milk. And number 3, the rabbis are extra stringent regarding meat and milk, since lo bedili inshe mine, people are not careful to separate themselves from them, as both meat and dairy are of themselves permitted individually. So although both the Rif and the Ran rule in accordance with Levi, there is an inherent difference between their answers, and will have ramifications for other cases. The Ran's last 2 answers hold that the stringency of the bread baked with meat is unique to meat and milk and has nothing to do with aroma. This is also the opinion of the Ramban, and he writes it there. And you're able to see that in English. It seems to me that what was taught by Rav Kahana, the son of Rav Chinana, the elder, and Rava from Parazika, does not support the opinion of Rav. For there it is an independent gezerah, independent ruling. For since the flavor of the meat is in the milk, even though it is the only smell, it appears to people as meat and milk, and therefore that's why it is forbidden. And it carries on a little bit more here. I'm just going to go to the conclusion because this is very long and very, I have to say, a little bit complicated here. The conclusion. We have seen that the question of whether one may eat bread that was baked in an oven together with meat may be eaten with dairy is actually an argument amongst the rabbis of the Rishonic period from 1000 to 1500. Although Rav Kahana explicitly prohibited eating this bread with dairy, Rashi holds that it is permitted because of this concept of reicha lav miltahi, that aroma is not significant. The Rif states that it is prohibited because in this case, reicha miltahi, here it actually is significant, as there is no nullification, or that it is not considered a bidi avad, an after the effect situation, i.e. one cannot activate the principle of nullification. The Ran and the Ramban also prohibit eating the bread with dairy, but due to the fact that there is a special stringency of meat and dairy and is not connected to the sugya of reicha. The Shulchan Aruch rules like the Rif, as does the Gra, whereas the Ramah has different rulings that might suggest he rules like the Ran. According to all the opinions we have seen, it is clear that cooking foods one after the other would not pose a problem. Therefore, if one cooked roasted meat in an oven and then later baked bread in the same oven, it will be permitted to eat the bread with dairy. However, this is by no means a simple matter in halacha, as although there is no problem of reicha, of smell, where the foods are not cooked simultaneously, there might still be a problem of ze'ah, of steam, but this is beyond the purview of this article. I want to summarize a little bit because that was, after starting it, realizing is a little bit overly complicated to express in a few minutes. To summarize it in the best way possible, if you are to cook meat, a parva loaf, a non-meat or non-dairy loaf with meat in the oven at the same time, you cannot serve that bread with dairy. That's clear. However, if I have bread that is cooked in a meat oven, but there's nothing going on in that oven, it's just bread in that oven, that bread can be eaten with dairy, okay? For Sephardim, lechatchila, as an ideal. For Ashkenazim, it's a b'diavad, only after the fact. So Ashkenazim, they need to be more careful that the oven is specifically, hasn't been used for 24 hours, then they could eat that bread with dairy. But for Sephardim, we would say even if meat had only been used within a couple of hours or even it just come out, we would have that bread with dairy, okay? And we'll see more of this as we go along. All right, so therefore, that's what's going on. So very simply, if the meat is in the oven at the same time, that bread becomes meat, and you have to eat it with meat, even though all the ingredients are parva. If the bread is cooked in a meat oven, but there's no meat in the oven at the time of cooking, for Sfaradim, even if meat was recently cooked within the last hour or so, ideally you could still serve that bread with dairy. For Ashkenazim, that would only work b'di'avad, after the fact. For them, for Ashkenazim to eat it with dairy, there'd have to be a 24-hour period between the last time that meat was cooked in that oven before eating it with dairy. I hope that clears things up, and that is the end of that.